When red wine exploded across my $50,000 rental gown, I smiled at my daughter-in-law and calmly told her she'd just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. I walked out of that wedding reception with wine dripping from my designer beadwork, and by the time I reached my car, I'd already decided to destroy her family's empire. 3 months later, she'd learn exactly what happens when you humiliate a woman who spent 30 years as a forensic accountant. If you're watching this story, let me know in the comments where you're from and what you think you'd do in my situation. This gets wild, and I promise you won't see the ending coming. But let me back up and tell you how we got to that moment, because the devil, as they say, is in the details. The whole disaster started 6 months earlier when my son David announced his engagement to Vanessa Ashford. I should have known right then that trouble was brewing. Not because she wasn't lovely, she was absolutely stunning in that perfectly polished way that money can buy, but because of how she looked at me during that first family dinner, like I was a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the decor. "Mom, Vanessa's family owns Ashford Industries," David had said. His chest puffed with pride. "You know, the shipping company?" I knew Ashford Industries all right. Any accountant worth her salt knew them. Multi-billion-dollar empire, fingers in everything from logistics to real estate. Old money, the kind that builds dynasties and buys politicians. The wedding planning was a nightmare from day one. Vanessa had ideas, all of them expensive and most of them designed to remind everyone exactly which family was footing the bill. The venue had to be the Ritz-Carlton. The flowers had to be imported from Belgium. The photographer had to be some celebrity artist who charged more per hour than most people made in a month. The dress was Vanessa's idea too. "You simply must wear something spectacular, Margaret. Divine, and $50,000 for a rental." I nearly choked when I saw the price tag, but Vanessa just waved it away. "Consider it our gift to you. You're going to be family after all." The wedding day dawned perfect. The ceremony was at the family estate with 300 of their closest friends. I counted maybe 20 people from our side, lost in a sea of society faces I recognized from newspaper columns. During the reception, I was making small talk when it happened. I was holding a glass of water, gesturing while telling a story about David's childhood, when a single drop fell from my glass onto the hem of Vanessa's dress. One drop. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry." I'd immediately grabbed my napkin, reaching to blot the barely visible spot. That's when Vanessa's face changed. For just a split second, I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. Then she gasped, stepped backward, and somehow, though I swear she did it on purpose, her wine glass tipped over, sending a full glass of red wine cascading down the front of my dress. "Oh no!" she cried, her hand flying to her mouth in mock horror. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I'm so clumsy when I'm startled." The entire reception turned to stare. I stood there, wine dripping from the intricate beadwork, creating an ever-expanding stain across the silk. "It was an accident," Vanessa said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Just like yours was, of course." But I'd seen that look in her eyes. This hadn't been an accident. This had been a power play, a deliberate humiliation designed to put me in my place. That's when I smiled and delivered my promise. "Don't worry about it, darling," I told Vanessa, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned reception. "Accidents happen. Though I have to say, the rental company is going to be very upset about this. $50,000 is a lot of money, even for an accident." I left through the garden exit, my dignity intact despite the wine stains. But as I sat in my car, hands shaking with rage and humiliation, I realized something important. Vanessa Ashford had just made a critical error. She'd assumed I was some harmless older woman she could dismiss and humiliate without consequences. She had no idea who she was dealing with. 3 days after the wedding, the rental company's bill arrived. $57,000 for a destroyed designer gown. Irreparable damage due to liquid staining. I stared at the invoice over my morning coffee, and something inside me shifted from hurt to resolve. I paid it without blinking. Then I did something Vanessa would never expect from a harmless older woman. I started digging. 30 years as a forensic accountant teaches you one fundamental truth. Everyone has secrets, and rich people have the most expensive ones. I'd built my career unraveling financial mysteries, following paper trails that led to embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion. I knew how to look where others couldn't see. My first stop was my home office, where I'd kept every professional contact I'd ever made. I started with the basics: corporate filings, SEC reports, anything public that might give me insight into Ashford Industries. On the surface, everything looked pristine. Annual revenues in the billions, steady growth, glowing reports from financial analysts. But I'd learned long ago that the surface was where people painted their prettiest lies. "Margaret, you're scaring me," my friend Linda said when I called her at the accounting firm where she still worked. "Why are you suddenly interested in Ashford Industries?" "Let's just say I have a personal interest in understanding their business practices," I replied, scrolling through incorporation documents. "Can you still access those federal databases we used to use?" That evening, David called. I could hear the strain in his voice before he even spoke. "Mom, Vanessa's really upset about the dress thing. She feels terrible about the accident." I set down my teacup with deliberate precision. "I'm sure she does. The thing is, her father wants to pay for the cleaning bill. Make things right. How generous of him. Tell Mr. Ashford the bill was $57,000, and I've already paid it." The silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "$57,000? Mom, that can't be right. I have the receipt if you'd like to see it." I kept my voice level. It was quite the educational experience, learning about the insurance requirements for couture rentals. "Jesus, Mom, I had no idea. Vanessa said it was just a regular dress." "Interesting. So the new Mrs. Turner had been feeding her husband lies already. Well, now you know. Consider it a wedding gift to your bride, a lesson in the cost of actions." "That's not fair." "It was an accident." The words hung between us like a challenge. I could tell him what I'd seen in his wife's eyes, the calculated coldness before she spilled that wine. But David was still in the honeymoon phase. "Of course it was, dear. I'm sure Vanessa would never deliberately humiliate someone. Especially not at her own wedding." My son wasn't stupid. He heard the edge in my voice. "Mom, please don't make this into something it's not." "I'm not making it into anything, David, but I am learning some very interesting things about your new family." After I hung up, I stared at the financial documents scattered across my desk. Ashford Industries was massive, complex, with tentacles reaching into dozens of subsidiary companies. But complexity often masked simplicity. And in my experience, when rich people created complex structures, they were usually hiding something simple: theft. I'd found 3 discrepancies already. Shell companies that received large payments but had no apparent business purpose. Shipping routes that didn't match cargo manifests. International transfers that seemed designed to avoid certain reporting requirements. It was like finding a thread sticking out of an expensive sweater. You could ignore it, or you could pull it and see what unraveled. I reached for my phone and dialed Linda's number again. "It's me," I said when she answered. "How would you feel about doing a little freelance work? The paying kind?" "Margaret, what are you getting yourself into?" I looked at the wine-stained dress hanging in my closet. The $57,000 reminder of my new daughter-in-law's accident. "Something I should have done years ago," I said. "I'm going to find out exactly how the Ashford family really makes their money." 2 weeks into my investigation, I found the first real smoking gun buried in a subsidiary company's tax filings from 2019. Ashford Maritime Solutions had reported moving cargo worth $12 million through the Port of Charleston, but the customs declarations I managed to track down showed only $8 million in declared value. $4 million in merchandise that somehow disappeared between the shipping manifests and the tax returns. "This is just one port, 1 year," I told Linda, as we sat in my kitchen, documents spread across the table like pieces of a very expensive puzzle. "If they're doing this systematically," Linda whistled low, "we're talking about tens of millions in unreported income, maybe more." My phone rang, David's ringtone. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but answered on the 4th ring. "Hi, sweetheart. Mom, we need to talk. Vanessa's father wants to meet with you." I felt my pulse quicken. "About what?" "He feels bad about the whole dress situation. He wants to take you to lunch, maybe discuss some business opportunities." "Business opportunities? How interesting. What kind of business opportunities?" "He knows you're a retired accountant. He mentioned something about consulting work, helping with some project assessments." I looked at the evidence scattered across my table and smiled grimly. Oh, I'd love to assess some of their projects. The next day at Romano's, Richard Ashford was already seated when I arrived. He stood to greet me, tall and distinguished with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that came from never being told no. "Margaret, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me." His handshake was firm, his voice warm. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of ordering wine. The 2015 Bordeaux here is exceptional." "Wine? Of course." "How thoughtful," I said, settling into my chair. "Though I think I'll stick with water for now." His smile flickered slightly. "Of course." I wanted to apologize again for the incident at the wedding. Vanessa was mortified. I'm sure she was. I kept my expression neutral. Accidents do happen. They do indeed. Which is why I insist on covering the cost of the damage. I watched his face carefully. The dress cost exactly what I paid for it. Something shifted in his expression. A flicker of calculation. $57,000 seems quite steep for a rental, don't you think? Interesting. So he'd already done his homework. I suppose that depends on whether you consider it steep to maintain one's dignity in front of 300 strangers. He leaned back slightly, reassessing. Good. Let him realize I wasn't some easily intimidated widow. You're absolutely right. Please allow me to reimburse you for the full amount. That's very generous, but unnecessary. I can afford my own expenses. I'm sure you can. David mentioned you had quite a successful career in accounting. The waiter appeared, giving me a moment to consider my response. When we were alone again, I decided to test the waters. I did all right. Forensic accounting mostly. Corporate investigations, that sort of thing. I watched his face carefully for any reaction to the word investigations. There it was, a subtle tightening around his eyes, quickly masked. How fascinating. That must have been challenging work. It had its moments. You'd be amazed what you can discover when you know where to look. Paper trails have a way of revealing the most interesting stories. Richard took a sip of his wine, his movements carefully controlled. I imagine they do. Actually, that brings me to why I wanted to meet with you today. We're always looking for experienced consultants at Ashford Industries. There it was. The job offer. Classic move, if you can't neutralize a threat, try to buy it. What kind of consulting? I asked innocently. Project assessment, due diligence, that sort of thing. We're expanding into some new markets, and having an experienced eye review our processes could be invaluable. I smiled. That sounds wonderful. I'd love to learn more about your business practices. Richard Ashford wasn't trying to buy my silence with a consulting job. He was positioning me to become complicit in whatever schemes I'd been uncovering. If I took this job, I wouldn't just be a witness. I'd be an accessory. It was brilliant, really. But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I needed their money more than I needed the truth. I accepted Richard Ashford's consulting offer with the enthusiasm of a woman grateful for the opportunity. We shook hands across the table at Romano's, and I watched satisfaction settle into his features. "I'll have my assistant send over the initial contracts and some preliminary materials for you to review," he said. "Nothing too complex to start, just some basic due diligence on a few subsidiary operations." "I look forward to it," I replied, and meant every word. 3 days later, a courier delivered a package to my door. Inside were contracts, corporate documents, and, most interesting of all, financial records for 6 different Ashford subsidiary companies. Richard had basically handed me a roadmap to their entire operation. "You took the job?" Linda's voice pitched high with disbelief when I called her. "Margaret, have you lost your mind?" "On the contrary, I think I've found it." I was already scanning through shipping manifests. "They've just given me legal access to exactly the information I need to build a case against them. A case you're now contractually obligated to keep confidential." I paused in my document review. "Actually, no. The confidentiality clause only applies to proprietary business information. It specifically excludes any obligation to conceal illegal activities." That evening, David called just as I was discovering some particularly creative accounting in the records for Ashford Maritime Solutions. "Mom, Vanessa told me her father offered you a consulting position. That's great news." "It's certainly interesting work," I agreed, highlighting a transaction that showed the same cargo being reported to 2 different tax jurisdictions at wildly different values. "Vanessa thought maybe we could all have dinner this weekend to celebrate." "That sounds lovely." "Dear, Though I should warn you, I might have some questions about the family business. Mom, David's voice carried a warning. I hope you're not planning to cause any trouble. The words hit me like a slap. Trouble? David, I'm doing the job your wife's father offered me. If that causes trouble, perhaps you should ask yourself why. By midnight, I'd identified a pattern that made my blood run cold. The discrepancies weren't random accounting errors. They were systematic, sophisticated, and pointed to something much larger than I'd initially suspected. Ashford Industries wasn't just hiding income from the IRS. They were moving money in patterns that suggested money laundering on an international scale. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands received payments from cargo that was declared at one value to U.S. Customs, but sold at much higher prices to end buyers. I sat back in my chair, the magnitude of what I'd discovered settling over me. This wasn't just about tax evasion anymore. This was about a family that had built their empire on systematic criminal activity. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Looking forward to dinner Saturday. Vanessa's excited to see you. I stared at the message, thinking about my son's naive enthusiasm, his beautiful criminal wife, and the family of felons he'd just married into. David had no idea what he'd stumbled into, but he would listen to evidence. He would have to. I picked up my pen and began making notes for my report. If the Ashfords wanted a consultant's professional opinion on their business practices, I was going to give them exactly what they'd asked for. And when I was finished, David would finally understand why his new family had been so eager to welcome him into their world. The real question was whether he'd choose truth over comfort when the moment came. Saturday dinner at David and Vanessa's new house was a masterclass in performance art. Their home was a wedding gift from Daddy, a colonial revival worth at least $4 million, complete with circular driveway and professionally landscaped gardens. Isn't it gorgeous? Vanessa gushed as she led me through rooms that looked like they'd been staged for a magazine shoot. Daddy insisted on hiring his decorator. I made appropriately appreciative noises while mentally calculating the property value. Conservative estimate. More money than David could earn in 50 years of marketing work. David appeared from the wine cellar, carrying a bottle that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Mom, you have to try this. It's from the same vineyard where we stayed on our honeymoon. I accepted the glass, noting the vintage. 2005, Brunello di Montalcino, $1,500 a bottle. It's lovely, I said, taking a small sip. Though I have to ask, David, how exactly are you affording all this? The question hung in the air like smoke. Vanessa's smile flickered, and David shifted uncomfortably. Well, Vanessa's family has been very generous. Generous how? I kept my voice light. Gifts? Loans? Employment opportunities? Mom, David's voice carried that warning tone again. We're doing fine financially. Before either of them could answer, my phone chimed with an email notification. It was from my contact at the Treasury Department, a former colleague who owed me several favors. Margaret, found what you were looking for. Ashford Industries flagged for suspicious activity reports in 2019 and 2021. Investigation pending, but low priority due to lack of evidence. Might be more interested now if someone had specific documentation. Call me. Sarah. Everything all right? David asked. Just work stuff, I said, slipping the phone back into my purse. Actually, Vanessa said brightly, Daddy mentioned that you're working on some projects for us now. How exciting. The way she said it made me look at her more carefully. There was something in her expression, a calculation that reminded me of the moment before she spilled wine on my dress. It's fascinating work, I agreed. Your father's business model is quite innovative. He's brilliant, Vanessa gushed, always finding new opportunities, new markets to explore. He says the key to success is staying ahead of regulations. Staying ahead of regulations. That was certainly one way to put it. It wasn't until dessert that Vanessa dropped her first real clue about what they actually knew. Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you found everything you need in the materials Daddy gave you? The question was casual, but her eyes were sharp. I'm making good progress, I replied carefully. Though some of the subsidiary structures are quite complex, I might need to dig deeper into the international operations. David and Vanessa exchanged a quick glance, so fast I almost missed it. I'm sure Daddy would be happy to provide additional documentation, Vanessa said. He's very committed to transparency. Transparency. from a family running what appeared to be a sophisticated money laundering operation. That would be helpful, I said, especially the customs declarations for the Caribbean routes. Some of the cargo values seem inconsistent. This time, the glance between them was unmistakable. Vanessa's smile became fixed, and David reached for his wine glass with slightly too much focus. "Which charities are you involved with?" I asked, changing direction. "Oh, several. The Maritime Heritage Foundation, the International Trade Education Society, the Caribbean Development Initiative." Each name hit me like a small shock. I'd seen those organizations in the financial records. They were all recipients of significant donations from Ashford Industries. As I drove home that night, I realized the dinner had been a test. They'd wanted to see how much I knew, how much I suspected, how much of a threat I might pose. By asking about the Caribbean routes, by showing interest in the charities, I'd revealed that I was looking at exactly the areas where their most damaging secrets were hidden. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Unknown number. "Mrs. Turner, this is Patricia Webb from Ashford Industries. Mr. Ashford asked me to call you about your consulting contract." I felt my stomach tighten. "What about it?" "There's been a change in scope for the initial project. Mr. Ashford would like to schedule a meeting with you first thing Monday morning to discuss the revised parameters." They were about to try to limit my access to the very information I needed. The Ashfords thought they were playing chess with an amateur. They were about to discover they'd invited a grandmaster to the board. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray December drizzle that made everything look like a crime scene. The Ashford Industries building was a monument to corporate success. 30 stories of glass and steel that dominated the downtown skyline. "Mr. Ashford will see you now," Patricia Webb announced, leading me through corridors lined with oil paintings that probably cost more than most people's houses. Richard's office occupied a corner of the 28th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of the harbor, where his shipping empire had allegedly been moving millions of dollars in undeclared cargo. "Margaret, thank you for coming in." He rose from behind a desk the size of a small aircraft carrier. "Please, sit down. I wanted to discuss your project scope," he began, sliding a manila folder across the desk. I opened the folder to find a revised contract that made my blood run cold. Where the original agreement had given me access to subsidiary financial records, shipping manifests, and international transaction data, this new version limited my review to domestic operational efficiency protocols. In other words, they wanted me to analyze office supplies while staying far away from anything that might reveal actual crimes. "This is quite a change," I said carefully. "We realized the initial scope was perhaps too ambitious. Starting smaller will allow you to get familiar with our systems." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired his skill. "I see. And if I were to continue with my current analysis of the international shipping protocols, would that be a problem?" The question hung between us like a blade. Richard leaned back in his chair, and for a moment his mask slipped just enough to show me the steel underneath. "Margaret, I think there might be some confusion about your role here. You're a consultant, not an auditor. Of course, though in my experience the two often go hand in hand. Not in this case." His voice carried a note of finality. "The revised contract clearly outlines your responsibilities." I looked down at the contract again, reading the subtle legal language that would effectively muzzle me. If I signed this, I'd be locked into a consulting role that gave me access to nothing useful while creating a paper trail that showed I'd reviewed and approved their operations. Classic corporate whitewashing. It was brilliant, and it would have worked perfectly if they'd been dealing with someone who actually needed the money. "This is very generous," I said, closing the folder, "but I'm afraid I can't accept these terms." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "The scope is too limited to provide you with meaningful value. If you're not interested in a comprehensive analysis, I don't think I'm the right consultant for this project." The silence stretched between us while Richard recalculated. This clearly wasn't the response he'd expected. "Margaret, I hope you're not making this decision lightly. Opportunities like this don't come along often." There it was, the implicit threat. Play ball or lose access to the game entirely. "I understand completely," I replied. "But my professional reputation is built on providing thorough, comprehensive analysis." Richard stood up, moving to the window with his back to me. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth. I think you should consider your position carefully, Margaret. Family relationships can be delicate, especially when outside conflicts create unnecessary stress. Translation: if you don't back down, we'll turn your son against you. I stood up too, slinging my purse over my shoulder with deliberate calm. Mr. Ashford, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what kind of person you're dealing with. He turned from the window, his expression guarded. You see, I continued, you've made the mistake of assuming I need something from you. Your money, your approval, your family's acceptance. But the truth is, I don't need any of those things. What I need is the truth, and I'm very good at finding it. Richard's face had gone completely cold now. Be very careful. Margaret, you're playing in a league you don't understand. I smiled, the same smile I'd given his daughter-in-law after she destroyed my dress. Mr. Ashford, I've spent 30 years unraveling financial crimes that were far more sophisticated than anything your family has managed. You're not playing in a league I don't understand. You're playing a game I helped invent. I walked to the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. Oh, and Richard, that wine your daughter spilled on my dress? I kept the receipts. Funny thing about evidence, it has a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times. I left him standing in his pristine office. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, my phone was already ringing. Sarah from Treasury. Margaret, I just got your message about the Ashford documentation. How soon can you get it to me? I stepped out into the December drizzle, feeling the electric thrill of a hunt about to reach its conclusion. How about this afternoon? I said. I think it's time the Treasury Department learned exactly how the Ashford family has been staying ahead of regulations. The game was about to change completely, and this time, I was holding all the cards. Sarah from Treasury met me at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where government employees could blend in with students and freelancers. She looked exactly like I remembered. Sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the demeanor of someone who'd spent 20 years following money trails. Margaret, you beautiful genius, she said, flipping through the documents I'd brought. This is a prosecutor's dream. You've connected transactions across 17 different subsidiary companies. 23? Actually, I found 6 more over the weekend. I sipped my coffee, watching her face light up. The Caribbean routes alone show nearly $40 million in unreported income over 3 years. Sarah whistled low. And you got all this from their own internal records? Richard Ashford hand-delivered it to my house. Signed, sealed, and legally obtained through a consulting contract that gives me explicit permission to review their financial operations. What about the confidentiality clause? I smiled. Read paragraph 7, subsection C. The confidentiality obligation specifically excludes any requirement to conceal illegal activities. Richard's lawyers were so confident they built their own loophole. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. These people really thought they were untouchable, didn't they? For 30 years, they've been right. I pulled out another folder. But here's where it gets interesting. The money laundering operation isn't Richard's brainchild. It's a family business that goes back to his father. I showed her the historical records I dug up, incorporation documents and tax filings that revealed a pattern spanning 3 decades. The Ashfords have been using their legitimate shipping business to move dirty money since the 1990s. Drugs, arms dealing, human trafficking. They don't care what they're laundering as long as the price is right. Sarah's expression grew grim. How much are we talking about total? Conservative estimate? $200 million in unreported income. If we factor in the money they've laundered for other criminal organizations, we're looking at transactions totaling over $1 billion. She closed the folders, her mind clearly racing. Margaret, you realize what you've just handed me? This isn't just tax evasion anymore. This is RICO territory. We're talking about dismantling an entire criminal empire. Good, I said simply. They earned it. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Mom, can you call me? Something's happened. I called David back as I walked to my car. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with panic. Mom, where are you? Downtown. What's wrong? I just got a call from Vanessa. She said her father had a meeting with you this morning. And now there are federal agents asking questions at their office. I felt a thrill of satisfaction. Sarah hadn't wasted any time. Federal agents asking what kind of questions? About financial records, shipping manifests, international transactions. Mom, please tell me you didn't do anything stupid. Stupid. That was an interesting choice of words from someone who'd married into a crime family. David, I did exactly what Vanessa's father hired me to do. I analyzed his business practices and provided my professional assessment. To the FBI? To the appropriate authorities, yes. Jesus Christ, Mom. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've exposed a criminal organization that's been stealing from the American people for 30 years. I'd say that's a pretty good day's work. They're family now. Vanessa is my wife. And Richard Ashford is a criminal who's been using his legitimate business to launder money for drug dealers and arms dealers. Your wife is a beneficiary of blood money, David. Even if that's true, why couldn't you just walk away? Why did you have to destroy everything? Because they humiliated me at your wedding. And when I tried to handle it quietly, they tried to buy my silence. And when that didn't work, they threatened to turn you against me, which, apparently, they've succeeded in doing. This isn't about choosing sides, isn't it? I interrupted. Because it sounds like you've already chosen, and it's not your mother. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with rage and heartbreak. By evening, the story had broken on the local news. Federal investigation targets major shipping company. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled in to watch my handiwork unfold on television. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like war. The next morning brought 3 phone calls that changed everything. The first was from my lawyer, warning me that the Ashfords had hired the most expensive criminal defense team on the East Coast. The second was from Sarah, telling me that Richard Ashford had been arrested at his home at 6 a.m. The third was from David, and his voice was completely different from the day before. Mom, I need to see you. Can I come over? Of course. When he arrived an hour later, he looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were red-rimmed, and his clothes looked like he'd slept in them. They arrested Richard this morning, he said, slumping into my kitchen chair. Vanessa's completely falling apart. I poured him coffee, noting the way his hands shook. How are you holding up? I don't know. I can't process any of this. He looked up at me with haunted eyes. Mom, is it really as bad as they're saying on the news? What are they saying? Money laundering, tax evasion, RICO charges. They're talking about criminal conspiracy going back decades. All of that appears to be accurate, yes. David put his head in his hands. How did I not see it? How did I marry into this and not have any idea what they were doing? For the first time since this all began, I felt genuine sympathy for my son. Because they're very good at hiding it, and because you had no reason to look for it. But you did. I thought about how to answer that. I started looking because Vanessa humiliated me, and I wanted to know who I was dealing with. I kept looking because what I found was too serious to ignore. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. What's going to happen to Vanessa? I don't know. That depends on how involved she was in the actual operations. She wasn't involved. She doesn't know anything about the business side. I pulled out one of the files I'd given to Treasury, the charity donation records. David, look at this. He reluctantly took the papers, scanning the highlighted entries. The Maritime Heritage Foundation received $3 million from Ashford Industries last year, I explained. The International Trade Education Society got $2.5 million. The Caribbean Development Initiative got $4 million. So, they're generous with charity donations. All 3 organizations are run by Vanessa. She's the president of Maritime Heritage, the executive director of Trade Education, and the founder of Caribbean Development. David stared at the papers, the implications slowly sinking in. David, these aren't real charities. They're shell organizations designed to create tax deductions while funneling money through the Caribbean banking system. Vanessa has been running 3 separate money laundering operations disguised as humanitarian work. The color drained from his face. That can't be right. Look at the expense reports. Maritime Heritage spent $60,000 on office supplies last month, but has no office. Trade Education paid $800,000 for educational materials to a company that doesn't exist. My son stared at the evidence, and I could see the moment when denial cracked and reality flooded in. She lied to me, he whispered, about everything. I'm sorry, sweetheart. No, you're not. His voice was bitter. You're happy about this. You get to be right about her. The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it, but only a grain. "I'm not happy that you're hurt," I said quietly. "But I'm not sorry that the truth came out." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "What am I supposed to do now? My wife is about to be arrested. My house is owned by criminals. Everything I thought I knew about my life is a lie. You start over. You separate yourself from their crimes legally and financially. And you decide what kind of man you want to be going forward." He turned from the window, his expression desperate. "Can you help me?" "Of course I can," I said. "But first, you need to answer a question honestly. Did you know anything about their business practices? Anything at all?" David met my eyes, and I saw my son, really saw him, for the first time in months. "No," he said quietly. "I swear to you, I had no idea." I believed him. Despite everything, I still loved him. And that was enough to start rebuilding what Vanessa Ashford had nearly destroyed. "Then we'll figure this out together," I said. "But you might need to testify against your wife." Vanessa's counterattack came exactly 72 hours after her father's arrest, delivered by a lawyer who looked like he charged $1,000 just to answer his phone. "Mrs. Turner, my client has some concerns about your recent actions," he said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table with practiced confidence. Marcus Blackwood was old-school Boston establishment, Harvard law, expensive suits, and the kind of political connections that could make problems disappear. If the Ashfords had hired him, they were playing for keeps. "I'm sure she does," I replied, pouring myself tea with deliberate calm. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Blackwood?" "This isn't a social call." He opened his briefcase with surgical precision. "My client believes you've acted in bad faith regarding your consulting agreement with Ashford Industries." "How so?" "You used your position of trust to gather information for the specific purpose of damaging the family business. That constitutes corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and possibly criminal conspiracy." I sipped my tea, letting him finish his speech. Marcus Blackwood was good, very good. Under different circumstances, I might have been intimidated. "Mr. Blackwood, have you actually read the consulting contract?" "Of course." "Then you know that paragraph 7, subsection C, specifically excludes any obligation to conceal illegal activities. Your client's father signed a contract that gave me explicit permission to report exactly what I reported." His confident expression flickered slightly. "The contract was signed under false pretenses." "Did I?" "Because as I recall, Richard Ashford offered me the position after I'd already asked pointed questions about shipping discrepancies and customs declarations. If he chose to hire someone who was asking the right questions, that suggests either remarkable stupidity or remarkable arrogance. My client was 19 when these alleged activities began. Your client was running 3 separate money laundering operations disguised as charities." I interrupted. "The youngest shell company was incorporated when she was 25. Try again." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "Those were legitimate charitable organizations." I pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Caribbean Development Initiative donated $2 million for hurricane relief to St. Lucia in 2023. St. Lucia didn't have any hurricanes in 2023. The money went to a bank account in Grand Cayman, controlled by Vanessa's offshore trust. He didn't touch the folder. Charitable organizations can make grants. The Maritime Heritage Foundation spent $800,000 on a maritime education program for disadvantaged youth. The program doesn't exist. The money went to pay for Vanessa's house, her cars, and what appears to be a very expensive jewelry collection. These are accounting errors, at worst. Mr. Blackwood. I leaned forward, letting steel creep into my voice. I've been tracking financial crimes for 30 years. I know the difference between accounting errors and systematic fraud. Your client didn't just know about her family's criminal activities. She was an active participant. For the first time since he'd arrived, Marcus Blackwood looked genuinely concerned. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want the truth. I want justice, and I want my son to understand exactly what kind of woman he married. Your son doesn't have to be involved in this." I almost laughed at the transparent manipulation. "My son is already involved. He's married to your client, he's living in a house bought with criminal proceeds, and he's been unknowingly benefiting from money laundering operations for months. We can protect him." "From what? From the truth?" Blackwood shifted tactics. "Mrs. Turner, you're a mother. Surely you understand the importance of family loyalty. Vanessa is your daughter-in-law now. She became part of my family when she threw wine on my dress to humiliate me in front of 300 people. Everything that's happened since then has been a direct result of that choice. This is about revenge? This is about consequences. Vanessa thought she could treat me like garbage because I was just some middle-class nobody who didn't matter. She was wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from David. FBI wants to interview me tomorrow. Can you be there? I showed Blackwood the message. It looks like your client's husband is ready to cooperate with federal authorities. I'd suggest you advise her to do the same. Blackwood stood up, snapping his briefcase shut with barely controlled frustration. This isn't over, Mrs. Turner. You're absolutely right, I agreed. It's not over. It's just getting started. After he left, I called Sarah to give her a heads up about the legal maneuvering. They're going to try to paint you as a vindictive mother-in-law, she warned. Let them try. I have 30 years of professional credibility and a paper trail that shows exactly how I obtained the evidence. What about your son? I looked out at my garden. Roses and lavender that had taken years to establish but now bloomed beautifully with proper care. My son is going to learn that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do, I said. The Ashfords were about to discover that good men could be very dangerous when they finally decided to stop being naive. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Vanessa herself, in a moment of breathtaking stupidity that would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so perfectly predictable. David called me at 7 a.m, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Mom, I need you to come over right now. And Mom, you were right about everything. I arrived at David's house to find FBI agents loading boxes into unmarked vans while neighbors clustered on sidewalks, whispering behind their hands. David met me at the door, his face gray with exhaustion and shock. They arrested Vanessa an hour ago, he said without preamble. But that's not the worst part. He led me to his home office, where Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI was waiting with files spread across his desk. Mrs. Turner, Agent Chen nodded. Thank you for coming. We have a situation that I think you'll find interesting. She gestured to bank statements and wire transfer records. Your daughter-in-law made some very poor decisions after her father's arrest. Instead of laying low, she decided to move money. I scanned the documents, my professional instincts immediately cataloging the transactions. She was trying to liquidate assets before they could be frozen. Exactly. $18 million moved to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore, all within 48 hours of Richard Ashford's arrest. That's not just money laundering, I realized. That's obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud, and destruction of evidence. Agent Chen smiled grimly. Your daughter-in-law just graduated from potential witness to primary defendant. David sank into his desk chair, staring at the evidence. She told me she was just consolidating accounts to help with legal fees. David, I said gently, $18 million is more than most people see in a lifetime. But there's more, Agent Chen continued. The transactions Vanessa made led us to accounts we didn't know existed, accounts that contain records going back 40 years. She pulled out another folder. The Ashford money laundering operation isn't just a family business. It's part of a larger criminal network that includes arms dealing, human trafficking, and drug distribution across the entire eastern seaboard. I felt my breath catch. How large a network? 17 different criminal organizations. Combined revenue of over $3 billion annually. The Ashfords weren't just laundering their own money. They were providing financial services to some of the most dangerous criminal enterprises in North America. David looked up from the bank statements, his face pale. You're saying Vanessa's family was working with drug dealers? And worse, Agent Chen confirmed. We found transactions linked to a human trafficking ring operating out of Miami for 15 years. The Ashfords provided shipping services and financial laundering for operations that enslaved over 200 women and children. The room fell silent as the full magnitude sank in. This wasn't just white-collar crime anymore. This was something monstrous. There's something else, Agent Chen said quietly. Something I think Mrs. Turner needs to know. She pulled out a final document, a wedding guest list from David and Vanessa's reception. We've been analyzing the attendees at your son's wedding. Do you remember a man named Victor Kozlov, mid-50s, heavily accented, sat at table 12? I remembered him vaguely, a quiet man who'd seemed out of place among the society crowd. Viktor Kozlov is the head of a Russian organized crime syndicate based in Brighton Beach. He was at your son's wedding as Richard Ashford's guest. My blood ran cold. You're saying I was in the same room with one of the most wanted criminals in the country, yes, along with representatives from 3 other major criminal organizations. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. This is insane. None of this can be real. Your wedding reception was essentially a business meeting for the largest criminal enterprise on the East Coast. I thought back to that night, the elegant crowd, the expensive wine, the moment when Vanessa had deliberately humiliated me. That's why she did it, I realized suddenly. That's why Vanessa threw wine on my dress. Both David and Agent Chen looked at me. She was establishing dominance, showing her father's criminal associates that the family could humiliate anyone with impunity. It wasn't just personal cruelty, it was a demonstration of power. Agent Chen nodded slowly. These organizations respect strength and despise weakness. Publicly humiliating someone and getting away with it would have sent a very clear message. David turned from the window, his expression a mixture of horror and fury. She used our wedding to intimidate my mother in front of criminals? Your wedding was never about marriage, David, I said quietly. It was about business. You were just the prop that made it look legitimate. For a moment, my son looked like he might be sick. Then something hardened in his expression, a resolve I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. What do you need me to do? He asked Agent Chen. Testify. Against all of them. We're going to dismantle this entire network, but we need someone on the inside who can verify the family dynamics, the business relationships, the way money flowed through their operations. David looked at me, and I saw the boy he'd been and the man he was becoming. Will you help me? He asked. I thought about the wine-stained dress, then about the 200 enslaved women and children whose suffering had funded my son's fairy tale wedding. Of course, I said. Let's destroy them all. The trial of United States versus Ashford began on a Tuesday morning in October at UNCG, almost exactly 1 year after that disastrous wedding reception. I sat in the gallery watching federal prosecutors lay out their case against Richard Ashford, his daughter Vanessa, and 14 co-conspirators who represented what the media had dubbed the largest organized crime syndicate in Eastern Seaboard history. David sat 3 rows ahead of me, dressed in his best suit, ready to testify against the woman he'd once loved enough to marry. The transformation in my son over the past year had been remarkable. Gone was the naive young man who'd been dazzled by wealth, replaced by someone who understood that integrity couldn't be bought. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh laid out the evidence with surgical precision. 40 years of money laundering, $3 billion in criminal proceeds, connections to human trafficking that had enslaved hundreds of victims. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Walsh said, this case is about a family that built an empire on other people's suffering. They didn't just steal money, they facilitated crimes that destroyed lives. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand knowing that every word would be scrutinized by defense attorneys who'd spent months trying to paint me as a vindictive mother-in-law. Mrs. Turner, Walsh began, please tell the jury how you first became aware of irregularities in Ashford Industries' financial practices. I looked directly at the jury, 12 ordinary Americans who would decide whether justice prevailed. I spilled a drop of water on my daughter-in-law's wedding dress, I said simply. She responded by deliberately throwing wine on my $50,000 rental gown. That incident made me curious about the kind of people I was dealing with. The prosecution methodically walked me through my findings. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the shipping manifests that didn't match customs declarations. I testified for 6 hours, answering every question with the precision that had made me successful as a forensic accountant. Blackwood's cross-examination was predictably vicious. Mrs. Turner, isn't it true that you began this investigation for purely personal reasons? That you were motivated by anger and a desire for revenge? I was motivated by professional curiosity that led to moral obligation, I replied. When you discover evidence of crimes that have harmed hundreds of innocent people, your personal feelings become irrelevant. When David testified the following day, his voice was steady as he described his gradual awakening to his wife's true nature. I thought I was marrying someone who shared my values, he said. Instead, I married someone who viewed compassion as weakness and law-abiding citizens as marks to be exploited. The prosecution's case was airtight, built on financial records, recorded conversations, and testimony from former associates. But the moment that sealed everyone's fate came during Vanessa's own testimony. Against her lawyer's advice, she'd insisted on taking the stand, apparently believing she could charm her way out of federal charges. "Mrs. Turner," Walsh said during cross-examination, "you've testified that you had no knowledge of your family's criminal activities, but you were the president of 3 separate organizations that served as money laundering vehicles. How do you explain that?" Vanessa's composure finally cracked. "Those were real charities. We helped people." "Which people specifically?" We provided educational opportunities." "To whom? Can you name a single beneficiary of your educational programs?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Vanessa finally whispered, "I don't remember." "You don't remember because there were no beneficiaries. Were there?" That's when Vanessa made the mistake that destroyed whatever sympathy she might have earned. "So what if they were?" she snapped. "Everyone does it. Everyone with money finds ways to avoid paying taxes. The only difference is we got caught." The courtroom erupted. Judge Martinez banged her gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. Vanessa had just confessed to criminal conspiracy in open court while showing complete contempt for the law. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Richard Ashford received 45 years in federal prison. Vanessa got 25 years. 14 co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years. 6 months after the trial ended, David and I had lunch at Romano's, the same restaurant where Richard Ashford had tried to buy my silence. "Any regrets?" my son asked. I thought about the question seriously. A year ago, I'd been a recently divorced woman looking forward to quiet retirement. Now I was a key witness in one of the largest criminal cases in federal history. "No," I said finally. "No regrets at all. Even about the marriage ending?" "Especially about the marriage ending. David, you deserve someone who loves you for who you are, not someone who sees you as a convenient cover for criminal activities." He nodded, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I've been thinking about what you said at the wedding reception. About consequences." "What about it?" "You told Vanessa she'd just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. Did you know then how big a mistake it actually was?" I smiled, remembering that moment when red wine exploded across my dress and I realized I was dealing with someone who'd fundamentally underestimated me. I knew she'd chosen the wrong person to humiliate. I had no idea she'd chosen the worst possible person. The forensic accountant. "The forensic accountant," I agreed. "With 30 years of experience, unlimited time, and absolutely nothing left to lose." David laughed, the first genuinely happy sound I'd heard from him in over a year. "Mom?" "Yes?" "Next time I get married, will you run a background check on her first?" "Sweetheart," I said, "next time you get married. I'm running a background check on her entire family, their business associates, and anyone who's ever co-signed a loan with them." "Deal." As we finished lunch, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, I'd thought my life was winding down. Instead, I discovered that sometimes your most important work begins when you finally stop accepting other people's limitations on what you're supposed to be capable of. Vanessa Ashford had tried to humiliate a harmless older woman at a society wedding. Instead, she'd awakened a forensic accountant with a lifetime of skills and nothing but time to use them. It had been the biggest mistake of her privileged life, and the best thing that had happened to mine. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.